1 Peter chapter 1. And I don't normally do this, but I brought a prop with me this morning. And I don't normally do this, but this is, if you can't see this is a solid gold deer. Okay, can you see it? Here, let me set it here. There, that's better. That is solid gold. I don't get that out very often, but it is. And I want to talk this morning about the genuineness of your faith. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 3 through, I better find it here. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you who are kept through the power of God, through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, that the genuineness or the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable even though tested by fire. You see, Peter says, he said, you know, brothers and sisters, you've been born again and you have a living hope and you have an inheritance that is imperishable and never going to fade away. And man, that's good. But right now, you're a little wigged out. You're distressed because of the trials that you're going through. But he says the purpose of those trials, is to check the genuineness or the proof of your faith. You see, Braddock, you might say, Braddock, you are so full of it. That is not pure gold. How do you know it's not? Okay. Boy, I didn't expect that answer, but that's a good one. That is exactly right. Yeah, we may as well quit. I have nothing else to say. But you see, if I perchance deceived you or told you that it was pure gold, you might test it. Okay? If it looked like real gold, if it felt like real gold, the only way that you can determine if it is or if it's not is to test it. Now, I was just reading on the internet this morning. Actually, it's brass, as you can all see. But I was reading, if we put that in a furnace, we would know immediately if it was gold or not, because brass melts at a lower temperature than gold does. That would be one way. I mean, there would be various ways there that you could test that to determine if it's genuine, if it's real. And that's what Peter's talking about there in 1 Peter. He says, you know what, you guys have got a great inheritance. It's imperishable and it's never going to fade away. But he says, right now, you're in the fire. And why are you in the fire? The purpose of the fire is to see if it's real. Because it may look real. Your faith may look real. It may sound real. My faith may sound real coming out of my mouth. But you know what? Sometimes I'm like a teapot. When the heat gets turned up, I start whining and whistling. Ooh! It's not a pretty sound either. But I want us to look this morning just a little bit about the genuineness of our faith. Now we're gonna look at this through the story of Joseph. So if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 37. While you're turning there, I want to read you a verse. I love it when the Bible comments on the Bible. We don't have to ask for some man's commentary. We let the Bible interpret and comment on the Bible. While you're turning to Genesis chapter 37, in the book of Psalms 105 there's a few verses here that talk about the story of Joseph. 105 verse 16. It says this, "And the Lord called for a famine upon the land. The Lord broke the whole staff of bread. The Lord sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons." This verse I want you to pay attention to. "Until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested Joseph." Now, if you know anything about the story of Joseph, he was betrayed by his brothers. He was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He was forgotten by the cupbearer. From my perspective, he wasn't tested by God at all. He was tested by people. He was tested, first off, by his brothers. He was tested by Potiphar's wife. But you see, if we take off man's glasses and we put on God's glasses, and we look at it from his perspective rather than ours, the Lord used people to test, to refine. You might even say to turn the knob up on the stove in Joseph's life. And it all depends on your perspective. Man, I got to put these on. I can't see a thing. And it's so important that you and I get the proper perspective. So I want us to look for just a few minutes the story of Joseph. We're going to start in chapter 37. Genesis 37. The first test that Joseph went through was he was betrayed by his brothers. You know, those closest to us are the ones when they betray us, hurt us the most. Now, I know a little bit about Facebook, just very little. But I know that you can be unfriended. Woo-hoo. So you got somebody on Facebook that wants to unfriend you. Woo-hoo. Man, that really hurt. But you know, it's totally different if your spouse or a family member or somebody decides to unfriend you. That is painful. That is a real test. You don't go woo-hoo there. I mean, because that hurts. And if you look, I know you're in chapter 37, but if you look over a few chapters in chapter 42, Joseph's brothers betrayed him, and in this scenario, I mean, we all know what happened to him. When his brothers first come to Egypt to look for something to eat, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And he says, "You guys are spies." And they say, "No, we're not." "Yes, you are." "No, we're not." "Yes, you are." And his brothers say, "No, we are 12 sons of one man. 10 of us are here, one's back home with Dad, and one is no more." And Joseph says, "No, you're spies." And he says, "Because of that, I'm going to take one of you and put you in chains, and the rest of you go back and get that other brother, because I don't believe you unless you go get him." And if you look, start in verse 21 of 42. You want to see how painful betrayal is? Then the brothers said to one another, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen." When did he plead with them? When they were going to sell him. And he says, "Don't." You know, there's sort of a little insight into what happened. "When he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them and said, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood." They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them, and he turned away from them and wept. Do you know how long it had been since he'd been betrayed? 20 years. 22 years later, the guy still, when his brothers start talking about that scenario, you know, the pain of that time just welled up inside him again. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever had, and you know the word betray means a breach of trust. If you've ever been betrayed by someone, I tell you, that is a test. The heat really gets turned up in that situation. I think of Jesus. Jesus was also betrayed. After the Passover, after the Passover meal, he's sitting with his disciples, the men that had been with him for over 3 years, and he says, "One of you tonight will betray me." And they're all like, "Is it me? Is it me? No, it's not me. I'm not going to do it." And then we know Judas, and we know how he betrayed him. Betrayed him with a kiss, a sign of affection, a sign of endearment, and he used that to betray the Lord. That is a test in your life and mine that you and I, and we've got to look at it. We've got to take off our glasses. Now, do you know what? And I think it's really important. God doesn't tell Heidi, "Heidi, I want you to betray your brother." Well, she might, depending on which brother, right? No. But that isn't the Lord. But you know what? In the midst of that situation, you got to take off this set of glasses, the ones that are human glasses, and we got to look at it from His perspective. What He can do with that, how He can use that. We got to see it from His perspective. Because if you read back there, those verses that we read in Psalms 105, it keeps saying, "The Lord sent." The Lord sent. Now, "Lord, here I am, send me." But don't send me the way you did Joseph. Could we do it in coach class? A little bit easier. Not that way. Secondly, first he was accused. He was betrayed by his brothers. Secondly, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. This is in Genesis chapter 39. And Joseph apparently was a nice-looking young man, especially to Potiphar, to his boss's wife. And one day she says to him, these are in verses, starting in verse 7, and Potiphar's wife says, "Joseph, you good-looking thing, come here. I have plans for you and I." And he said, "No." He said, and I tell you, I love his response, because he said, "You know what? My boss, your husband, has put everything in my hand except you. How can I sin against God?" Doesn't say, "How can I sin against your husband?" He says, "How can I sin against God?" You see, I do think Joseph had on a pair of glasses, and in that instance, he had on the right pair of glasses. He was seeing it from a different perspective, because he knew, well, yeah, it would have been wrong for him to take Potiphar's wife, and he would have sinned against Potiphar. But he saw a bigger picture there. He said, "How can I sin against God?" And of course, lots of times when we are falsely accused, people tend to take what we say or what we do and misconstrue it to change it for their own purposes. Potiphar's wife, all she was trying to do was cover her tracks. She really didn't want the truth to come out. I mean, Joseph could have said, Potiphar, you need to talk to your wife. Because I really wasn't interested in your wife. It was your wife that started making advances towards me. But she sort of blurred the facts there and says, when Potiphar came home from work, he says, Potiphar, this Hebrew that you brought in, he tried to make sport of us, and he come after me. And, man, I tell you, I was alone in the house with him, and all of a sudden he made advances on me, and I screamed, and he run out. And look what I got. Here's his little blanket he left. Man, those are trumped-up charges. Absolutely nothing true about that at all. In fact, the opposite. I remember years ago, Lana was falsely accused about taking something. And she didn't. And it was painful for her because it went on, because the person that was told that, that she took this item, it was told to a pastor's wife. And the pastor's wife believed this false accusation about her for years. Now, my wife wouldn't steal anything except my heart. Okay, all right. Just erase that. Okay, let's back up. My wife wouldn't steal anything. We'll keep going. And that was really painful for her. And do you know what she didn't do? She didn't try to defend herself. She did nothing. And years later, the opportunity came up for her to talk to this person. And it opened their eyes. But to be falsely accused of something. Now, I'm going to bring up something, and Derek, you don't need to keep bringing this up. But I remember, he still talks about this from the first time I shared this. I remember years ago, and this was years ago, I was working in a sorority. And at the end of the year, the people that I work for, the people who run the sorority, who own the sorority, the bosses, they always used to tell my kids, they said, you know what? Your kids can go in the house and take anything they want that's left in the girls' rooms. Because we've told them, do not leave anything in the rooms. Absolutely nothing. Don't leave anything in the rooms. And so, my kids loved this because they'd find 65 cents, behind the desk, or they'd find 42 pencils and erasers and all this sort of stuff. So we're going, and they just, it was like Christmas. They'd open up all the drawers, oh, look. Well, we opened up this one drawer, and it is full of T-shirts. Some of you remember. Huh? No, they weren't pink T-shirts. They were just regular T-shirts. They weren't pink T-shirts. And so it's like, wow, these are nice. I actually called the person that I work for, and I said, there's a whole drawer full. Somebody missed a drawer. I don't care. Get them out of there. We don't want them. So we took them all. Most of them went in my rag bag drawer. A couple of them I really liked. And the next fall, when the girls come back, I was working in that sorority, and you would not believe what T-shirt I had on. I had on one of these T-shirts. And before I got home, after I was done doing the work, my phone was ringing. And the House Corps president says, Scott, there's a girl at the house saying you stole her T-shirt. And I look down and I go, I said, Mary Beth, you remember the call? Oh, yeah, I remember the call. This was one of those T-shirts out of that drawer. So I had to explain the situation. But, I'll be reminded of this. I remember the first time I shared this story, he told everybody for 6 years or 7 years about this. Did you know Scott Braddock liked to wear sorority girls' T-shirts? No, I don't like to wear sorority girls' T-shirts. But you see, our natural tendency is to justify ourselves. I think of Jesus. Jesus was falsely accused by the high priest. Even brought before Pilate. I was thinking about this morning. He was brought before Pilate, and he was brought before Herod. And you know when he was brought before Herod, do you know what he said? Nothing. He said absolutely nothing. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't try to make things right. He just kept quiet. But that can be a painful test in your life and mine. Falsely accused, betrayed by his brothers. He was also tested with unfulfilled expectations. If you look in Genesis chapter 41, and then 41:1, and then if you just back up to the last few verses of chapter 40, Joseph's in prison. He's been given favor by the prison guard, and where he's staying happens to be where must have been where all the big political prisoners were, because Pharaoh put two of his closest people in prison. He put a cupbearer and he put a baker. Put his cook and the cupbearer in prison. You've heard the story. They both had dreams. Joseph walks into their cell and says, "Man, what's wrong? You guys are down. What's the deal?" And they said, "Man, we both had dreams, and nobody can tell us what it means." And Joseph said, and I like, again, he has an awareness of the Lord. He says, "Tell me your dreams. Maybe God will give you the interpretation." And he tells him the dreams. And he told the cupbearer, he said, in 3 days, you're going to be set back before your king, before the Pharaoh. And the baker, he says, well, it's not quite as good a news. In 3 days, you're going to be hung. After 3 days, that's exactly what happened. But Joseph said something to the cupbearer. He says, when you get out, would you talk to Pharaoh and tell him I'm in here? Because I was sold as a slave in this country, and then I was put in here on trumped-up charges. Really, I shouldn't even be in here. Could you tell your boss about me? And it says in the last verse, it says, the cupbearer forgot. In Genesis 41:1, it's so powerful to me, just the first few words. It says, and after 2 full years. I tell you, sometimes God's timetable is different than our timetable. Sometimes, and I'll change that. Most of the time, God's timetable is different than ours. After 2 full years, God, how come you didn't give Pharaoh the dream a couple of weeks later? But after 2 full years, and you see, there were only 3 people that knew that Joseph had interpreted that dream. One was dead, one forgot, and the other sitting in a prison cell. So after 2 full years, God gives Pharaoh a dream, gives him a couple of dreams. And he wants to know. You see, sometimes, lots of times, the waiting room is not a comfortable place. It's not a comfortable room. The Lord sometimes says, wait. And we say, Lord, now. And he says, wait. But you see, his clock, the hands on his clock, I look at my watch, the hands on his watch run differently, at a different speed than yours and ours. And we need to not lose hope. I wonder. I've tried to put myself in Joseph's shoes. I've never been in prison. Don't really want to try that route. But I've wondered how often he sat there right after he told the cupbearer, because the guy got out and he didn't hear a thing. I mean, he's like, I wonder if he told him. I wonder when I'm going to get out. I wonder if the Pharaoh's going to come see me. He had no idea what went on. And you would think, simply, I know how I would think, after a week, after a month, after a couple of months, the hope that you had would begin to dwindle, would diminish, would go. It isn't going to change. It's going to be the same. I'm going to rot here in prison. Now, I don't think he said that, but you see, our timetables are different. And if we go back to if we go back and we look at this through God's perspective, not our own, because our own says, I don't understand, man, I only got a few years on earth. How come I have to wait? The Lord's clock moves differently than ours. It does. And I think often of Abraham, and I've shared this before, but it's so powerful to me when I think about it. God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to inherit this land, and he has no kids. And he keeps telling him, your descendants are going to inherit this land, and he has no kids. And he waits 25 years. Now, I'm barely 25 years old, but I tell you, that is a long time. You know, to wait 25 years for the promise. From the first time the Lord spoke to him until it was fulfilled, he waited 25 years. Now that is a test. There are things in your life and mine that you have a hope. You feel like things are going to change, things are going to happen, and you know what? The hands on your clock are moving faster than the hands on his clock. But I tell you what the Lord's doing. He's checking to see how genuine your faith is. Are you going to keep your faith? Because the knob just keeps getting turned up. It may not be real high. It may just be on a simmer. But it's still, the heat is there. And what are you going to do? Are you going to say, no, I've had enough of this? You can't. Because the genuineness of your faith is proved by testing. Lastly, and it is just thinking about the timetable. It was 13 years from the time he was sold. He was 17 years old when he was sold. The Bible says he was 30 when he became Pharaoh's right-hand man. 13 years he waited. The last test I want to look at, and I think it's probably the greatest test that Joseph faced, and that was his success. Because you see, after he interpreted the dream, and he told Pharaoh, he says, God told you this twice. This is really what's going to happen. You need to find somebody that has enough foresight and insight and wisdom to know what to do so that you guys don't starve to death, because you're going to have 7 good years. And if you live fat and happy for 7 years, when the lean years come, you're not going to have anything. He says, you need to find somebody that's wise enough to think about those 7 years. We all know what happens. He's exalted to the second in command. And if you look back, let's jump back right quick to Psalms 105, because there's a couple verses there I want to read that I didn't read earlier. Psalms 105. In verse 20. Psalms 105:20. The king, or Pharaoh, sent and released Joseph, the ruler of the peoples, and set him free. Pharaoh made him lord of his house and ruler over all his possessions. Now this is a powerful verse. To imprison his princes at will. You see, Joseph was second in command. He could put in prison whomever he wanted to. People like Potiphar and his wife. I wonder what they thought when they realized Joseph was the prime minister. You see, it would have, because it says that Pharaoh said, only in the throne am I greater than you, Joseph. Everywhere else, you're the top dog. And you can do whatever you want, basically. And he could have put them in prison. He could have talked to the cupbearer and says, you know what? I waited. I sat in that prison for another 2 years while you lollygagged with the Pharaoh. He could have done something. I've shared this before. Temptation or a test is that which is within your reach. I've never been tempted to buy a Ferrari. I never have. Why? It's out of my reach. It's out of my grasp. I can't do it. Okay. A Chevy Love? Huh? I'll sell you my gold deer. But you see, that's out of my reach. I can't reach that. When Joseph was in prison, I wonder if he had little mental scenarios. You know, if I ever get out of here, I'd like to settle the score with Potiphar and his wife, especially his wife. What could he do? There wasn't a temptation in prison. He was a prisoner. But all of a sudden, he's second in command. Now he could do something. Now he could do something. That which was within his grasp. What do you and I do when it's within our power to settle the score? The problem is when you and I try to settle the score, we end up like those that have hurt us, that have falsely accused us, that have betrayed us. We end up just like them. Psalms 105 says that the word of the Lord tested him, but God used people. And I think my faith would be just pure gold if it wasn't for people. It'd be real. It'd be shiny. You know, I could polish it. My faith would be, man, I'm walking with the Lord. And the problem is, when I start polishing it, then somebody shows up and wants to hold it. Put their fingerprints all over it. It makes me mad. If it wasn't for people, my faith would be just fine in the Lord. Ding! Yeah, that's right. The Lord is going to test you, and He's going to use people to check the genuineness of your faith through those people that are around you. I want to conclude with this. A couple of things that I think that it's really important for us to remember. And I'll tell you what it does is it helps us put on the right glasses. When Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, he said to them, he says, you know what, brothers? And he uses the word sent at least 3 times. I just read it this morning. This is in Genesis 45. When he finally tells his brothers, he says, brothers, come here. Look at me. I'm your brother. It wasn't you who sent me to Egypt. It was God who sent me. He says, don't be angry with yourselves, because the Lord sent me before you to preserve lives. And he says that to them several times. And they're like, I tell you, that would have been an interesting little conversation to be a part of there. They're like, how did you end up here? How did you get here? Well, let me tell you, the road wasn't easy. But the Lord sent me. You see, but it is so important that you and I have on that set of glasses, the ones that would look at our testing, our trials from His perspective. Because it's so easy to look at them when we're in the middle of them. It's so easy to look at those people that have betrayed us, people. So easy to look at somebody that might falsely accuse you. But we need to look at it from His perspective. He had an awareness that God was in control of his life. And I think the other thing that's really important for us to remember, and this is in 1 Peter 4, verse 2. Peter says, don't be surprised when fiery trials come upon you. Don't be surprised. Man, if you find yourself, if the stove is on hot, you're going, man, why? Why am I going through this? Don't be surprised. You know why? Because the Lord is just checking to see how genuine your faith is. And if it's not pure, you know what He does? He purifies.